So that happened today. The FDA advisors back the COVID vaccine for kids 5 to 11 years old. Now, keep in mind, kids, an unvaccinated child is at less risk of serious illness from COVID than a 70-year-old fully vaccinated person. A child has more risk from influenza than they have from COVID. And even if you're vaccinated, you can spread the virus and you can get the virus, and everyone is going to get the virus. That's according to Joe Biden's director of COVID response, Andy Slavitt, who said because the vaccine's so leaky and because the Delta variant, there are going to be more mutations, we're not going to be able to stop it. Everybody's going to get COVID, that's it. So you're not going to be able to stop yourself from getting it. And right now we're seeing all across the world, the highest vaccinated countries are having big outbreaks. Like right now, Ireland, which is like 92% vaccinated, they're having an outbreak. 43% of all the people in the hospital from COVID are vaccinated. And they're having a huge outbreak. So just like Dr. Robert Malone, who invented the mRNA vaccine technology, said on this show, you cannot vaccinate your way out of an outbreak in a pandemic with a leaky vaccine that we have. You can't do it. And they're proving him right. And they're proving this show right. So this idea that we have to vaccinate children to protect the elderly is crazy. That's a crazy idea. If you want to protect the elderly, get the elderly vaccinated because they're going to get it anyway. Everyone's going to get COVID. And that's what people need to get. So that should take away people's fear of the unvaccinated. And it should make them rethink this. Because guess what? Here is from the FDA committee has approved the Pfizer vaccine emergency use authorization. So that means there's been no long-term studies on this at all. And so it's for kids 5 to 11. In making this decision, the FDA conceded it does not know the long-term risks to these kids. Even worse, listen to this. This is from a voting member on the FDA panel. And keep in mind that the head of the vaccine department at the FDA just resigned over the politicization and the push for booster vaccines by the Biden administration. Just resigned at the FDA. So now they got rid of the problem. Just think of, that's how I look at it. They got rid of that one squeaky wheel, and now they replaced them with an unsqueaky wheel. So listen to what this person says, who's a voting member on the FDA.
But we're never going to learn.
Here we go.
But we're never going to learn about how safe the vaccine is unless we start giving it. That's just the way it goes.
So I'm going to play that again so you can hear what he said.
And I think what sways me here is that is a very sort of personal choice. If I had a child who was a transplant recipient, I would really want to be able to use a vaccine like this. And there are certainly kids who probably should be vaccinated. The question of how broadly to use it, though, I think is a substantial one. And I know it's not our question, but I know we're kind of punting that to ACIP. But I do think that it's a relatively close call. And as Dr. Levy just said, as Dr. Gann said, it really is going to be a question of what the prevailing conditions are. But we're never going to learn about how safe the vaccine is unless we start giving it. That's just the way it goes. That's how we found out about rare complications of other vaccines like the rotavirus vaccine. And I do think that we are going to, I do think we should vote to approve it. But we're never going to learn about how safe the vaccine is unless we start giving it. That's just the way it goes.
We're never going to learn about how safe the vaccine is until we start giving it. Now, I just want to... I just want to make this available. Children's extremely low risk confirmed by study. The overall risk of children becoming severely ill or dying from COVID is extremely low, a new analysis confirms. An unvaccinated child is less risk of serious COVID illness than a vaccinated 70. That's the New York Times. That's not Jimmy Dore. That's not Breitbart. That's the New York Times. For children without a serious medical condition, the danger of severe COVID is so low as to be difficult to quantify. The risks of long COVID among children, a source of fear among many parents, is also very low. New York Times. According to the CDC, among children, the mortality risk from COVID-19 is actually lower than from the flu. And yet we're going to line these kids up and mass vaccinate them. Here's a little bit more from the FDA hearing. This is from someone named Sarah Beth Berwick. She watched the FDA advisory meeting today on 5 11-year-olds getting the vaccine and heard 3 important points we probably won't hear in the media headlines. 1, experts are not sure whether and to what extent the vaccine prevents transmission. Expert 2, experts do not know how long any purported benefits will last and therefore also have no idea whether or when or how often boosters will be recommended. I would add number 4. Many members cited school disruptions as a reason to authorize. This is driven by policy, not health. Schools didn't and don't need to close. Pfizer's child vaccine boosts an efficacy of 90.7% in the short term. According to Pfizer, long-term safety of COVID-19 vaccine in participants 5 to 12 years old will be studied in 5 post-authorization. So they're going to study it after they authorize it. Is that okay to you? That's not okay to me. And this is the guy who was on my show who invented the mRNA vaccine technology. He said there's absolutely no scientific or medical justification for vaccinating children, in my opinion. This man must be stopped. That's exactly right. Because here's what he's saying.
So if all goes well and we get the regulatory approval and the recommendation from the CDC, it's entirely possible, if not very likely, that vaccines will be available for children from 5 to 11 within the first week or 2 of November.
Okay, and how are you going to get the truth about this from the mainstream news media? Because if you turn to the mainstream news media, this is what you get.
Is brought to you by Pfizer.
CBS Health Watch sponsored by Pfizer.
Anderson Cooper 360. Brought to you by Pfizer.
ABC News Nightline. Brought to you by Pfizer. Making a difference. Brought to you by Pfizer.
CNN Tonight. Brought to you by Pfizer. Early Start. Brought to you by Pfizer. Friday night on Aaron Burnett Out Front. Brought to you by Pfizer.
This Week with George Stephanopoulos is brought to you by Pfizer.
This weather report brought to you by Pfizer.
Today's countdown to the royal wedding is brought to you by Pfizer.
And now a CBS Sports Update brought to you by Pfizer.
Meet the Press data download brought to you by Pfizer.
This portion of CBS This Morning sponsored by Pfizer. On how to find the hidden sugars in the American family diet. Sponsored by Pfizer.
Okay, so with one more thing before I bring in Michael Tracy, I just want to show you who's on the FDA approving this stuff. Board member, Pfizer chairman, Thomson Reuters Foundation, former president and CEO of Thomson Reuters. That seems wrong that guy would be a board member of Pfizer. Also, Scott Gottlieb. Who is he? Well, he was the 23rd commissioner of the FDA. He served from 2017 to 2019. What's he doing now? Well, he was previously the FDA's deputy commissioner for medical and scientific affairs, senior advisor to the FDA commissioner. So he's been there his whole life. And what is he doing now? He works for Pfizer. He's on the Pfizer board. So just so you know, that's who's making these decisions. So let me bring in Michael Tracy. Michael Tracy, journalist extraordinaire. Michael, what do you now? Again, we have to reassert Michael Tracy's not anti-vax, nor am I. But we have critiques and criticisms of how they're rolling out the vaccines and how they're handling COVID. So, Michael, let me bring you in. Go ahead and comment on this.
Yeah, let me give again my hostage statement that I am not anti-vax. That's my, this obligatory preface, which of course you could say a million times and it doesn't matter because anything that you say that departs even minimally from the accepted narrative is going to get construed as this insidious anti-vax, conspiracy mongering that implicates you in somehow wanting to commit mass murder. But I think the perverse thing with this whole mad rush to vaccinate young children as quickly as possible is that often you get the sense that the intention is more to achieve an emotional release for the adults than to actually protect the health of the children. Like you'll often see pundits and some of these public health officials who really don't make any sense anymore and have been incoherent for about a year and a half. You'll often see them expressing how desperate they are to make sure that children can be vaccinated, and what they're not so convincingly concealing is that it's all about achieving some kind of emotional catharsis for them, more so than doing anything which is strictly needed to protect the welfare of the children. Because as has been definitively established by mountains of evidence from all over the world, and which you just showed an example of in your segment, children are astronomically low risk from COVID. That's just true. I mean, that's not able to be disputed anymore in any reasonable scientific way. And yet, somehow it's treated as some kind of existential crisis for children as young as 2 or even infants to not be vaccinated at this point. And why? Why? Because there's this whole kind of system of thought and ideology around COVID amongst the most diehard practitioners of the faith that says in order to achieve salvation, we must vaccinate anybody and everybody, regardless of whether it actually has merit or utility in protecting their individual health. And for 99.999% of children, it just doesn't. So what's the real purpose behind it? Well, there could be a commercial incentive. As you mentioned, Pfizer has its tentacles in pretty much everything. But I also think there's this kind of underlying political / ideological motive, which says that even if it has no benefit to the children, we must get them vaccinated because that's going to show that we finally defeated the virus. And what if it happens to still be endemic at that point? Don't know. Maybe they'll double, triple vaccinate the children. It's just kind of this circular reasoning that doesn't end in any kind of conclusion to when we can stop treating this as an emergency, or when the normalcy that was temporarily sacrificed to curtail the worst phase of the pandemic can actually be abolished with finality, meaning that things can be normal. So I won't have to go around where I live in Jersey City, New Jersey, and see lines of children standing outside to go into their school, and these are like 4 and 5-year-olds wearing masks that they have been wearing all day and must wear even when they're like playing on the playground. I mean, it's a preposterous. And I was never even somebody who assigned much importance one way or another to wearing a mask. I mean, in the early part of 2020, I said, you know what? Even if it's a kind of a marginal mitigation measure, I'm okay with temporarily wearing a mask, even if I couldn't give you chapter and verse from a standpoint of scientific authority on why it was the correct thing to do. I thought, it couldn't hurt, right? But now you got to the point where you're habituating children in these developmentally formative stages to be constantly masked for going on 2 years of their little lives without any sound rationale behind it. New Jersey and Virginia are the 2 states that have kind of these off-year gubernatorial elections. So the incumbent Democratic governor of New Jersey, Phil Murphy, is up for re-election next Tuesday. And one of his big planks, one thing that he's aggressively campaigning on, is how he is going to maintain the imposition of a mask mandate at New Jersey public schools, including preschools, for the foreseeable future, whereas his opponent, who's sort of this kind of squishy moderate Republican, he's some kind of MAGA insurrectionist troglodyte, who wants to bring Florida and Texas to New Jersey because he's not so sure about maintaining perpetual mask mandates at public schools. So somehow you're this extremist right-winger who, I don't know, wants to topple the government and wants to worship at the altar of Donald Trump. If you think maybe we've gotten to a point where masking 2-year-olds for the majority of their day is no longer necessary and they actually can produce some harms that we can't quantify at this time because this has not been done before in the United States anyway. Joe Biden was just in New Jersey, right near me actually, earlier this week, and he visited a preschool where he's surrounded by children wearing face masks. And nobody even stops to give any kind of rationale for why that is remotely sensible, which it's not. Again, it's about making these adults who have a lot invested ideologically, politically, sometimes even financially in the prolongation of this whole COVID kind of emergency mentality. It's about giving them a sense of assurance and accomplishment. It's not about protecting the children because the scientific evidence doesn't back up that the children need that protection. It's about this kind of psychic need that overbearing and paranoid adults have, most of whom vote Democratic, in continuing the status quo for as long as humanly possible, it would seem. And it's having all these kind of crazy distortive effects. And even again, politically, I mean, for an incumbent Democratic governor of New Jersey to be emphasizing so stridently that the reason he must be reelected and why his opponent is unacceptable is because he will keep 2-year-olds masked. I mean, that's what we've come to. I mean, it's beyond the point where you can even reason with it in an intelligible way.
And people keep using the argument of, well, you know, kids shouldn't they wear a seatbelt in a car? You wear a seatbelt because you're recognizing you're taking a risk. That's why you're willing to drive 50, 65 miles an hour when you know it's a lot safer to drive 10 miles an hour, but you don't. Why do you? But you're willing to take that risk, and that's why you put on the seatbelt, right? So you know you're taking this risk. So sending a kid to school, there's risk involved in getting in a car wreck. This is the argument Glenn Greenwald was making, and they got a bigger chance of being injured in a car accident than they do from COVID. So, but you don't want kids to stay home because they might get in a car accident on their way to school. So. Yeah. Go ahead. And
they're still shutting down schools around the country on totally fallacious grounds. I mean, any given day, do a Google search for school closure, and you'll come up with a middle school in Michigan or someplace in Washington State or wherever, where because of a supposed outbreak, they're reverting back to the 2020 approach to COVID mitigation and shuttering the school, sometimes for a week or 2 weeks, and going to this, farcical remote learning setup, which makes no sense for a lot of children, and has harmed their ability to learn, again, at these very developmentally formative stages. And what they'll classify as an outbreak is also nonsensical. They'll say it's an outbreak and therefore dangerous. I mean, that term itself has a connotation of carrying some kind of danger, right? Well, is it really an outbreak that warrants this kind of excessive reaction if the outbreak is resulting in, which it does most of the time, kids getting COVID, contracting allegedly the virus, given the tests that they have to take compulsorily, getting the virus and having no symptoms? I mean, is that an outbreak which everybody should be alarmed by and should be, running around as though it's this great crisis? Or should that just be accepted as something normal now with an endemic disease? And actually, it's probably in a way good for a young child to contract the virus, not develop symptoms, and then produce antibodies. But for some reason, so many of these bureaucratic officials in kind of on an administrative level and on a political level and also within these public health bodies, which are these kind of like useless quangos, they refuse to recalibrate when an outbreak ought to be regarded as some sort of dangerous event, and when it's just what you would totally expect and is normal over the course of the circulation of an endemic disease. And they don't care about the collateral damage of kids for the second, in some cases the third straight school year being deprived of pretty critical learning opportunities. There was at one point last month in Chicago, there was something like 10 or 15,000. I wish I had the exact number in front of me. There was a preposterous number of students in the public school system who were in quarantine because they had supposedly tested positive or were exposed to COVID. Now, I mean, do you think in Chicago or really most other cities or really anywhere that quarantine is going to be rigorously enforced so that, for 10 days, a 16-year-old is dutifully confining himself to his room and not having contact with anybody, and keeping up with his studies and being very compliant. No, I mean, it's a joke. Everybody knows it's a joke, but they're all kind of playing along with this facade. Which, if public policy is forcing you to play along with the facade that you know is BS, probably about time to reevaluate the public policy. But there's so much bureaucratic inertia behind this now, as well as financial investment in, for example, stuff like making sure these testing regimens never go away. Because, every time one of these tests are administered, sometimes school districts have relationships with testing providers, and they have to pay money to these testing providers, and they're making a killing. So why would they ever want to get rid of the tests? And why would they ever want to, therefore, stop this whole system where testing results in the detection of these benign COVID cases, and therefore, and consequently, you have these totally spurious closures of schools for weeks on end? I mean, no longer does it just not make any sense. Now I think it's perfectly justified to look at it incredibly cynically, and as almost like this new extractive industry, where this whole cadre of financial interests crowded the market, given an emergency situation early on, and now are clinging to their market share and trying to wring out every last penny they can from it, while they can still justify this as some sort of urgent public health measure, which it's not.
Well, let's keep going here, because here's what the BBC said. The scientists in the UK not backing COVID jabs for 12 to 15-year-olds. So that was from across the pond. That was in September. Now here we are at the late October in the United States, and they're like, no, let's do it for 5-year-olds. Even though there's absolutely no reason to give it to 5-year-olds. Here's another one. UK panel does not recommend COVID vaccines for healthy 12 to 15-year-olds. You recommend vaccinating the people who are vulnerable, the people with comorbidities, the people who are elderly. And then you let it circulate, because you're all going to get the virus. There's no getting away from this. You think that you can insulate yourself from getting COVID, you are wrong. You're going to get it. So get vaccinated if you're afraid of it, and that will then lessen your symptoms, and you probably won't have to go to the hospital. That's what the science shows. So if you're afraid of it, you should get the vaccine, because you are going to get it, no matter if everybody's vaccinated. You can have 100% of the country vaccinated. You're still going to get it. Right now, in the counties with the highest vaccination rates, they have the highest transmission rates. Just like Dr. Robert Malone said on this show. So Britain's vaccine advisor said they were not recommending the vaccine of all 12 to 15-year-olds against COVID-19, preferring a precautionary approach in healthy children due to a rare side effect of heart inflammation. In Sweden, children aged 12 to 15 are only eligible for a vaccine if they have lung disease, severe asthma, or another high-risk medical condition. Some European medical experts point to safety concerns, advising them that more studies need to be done to ascertain the risks of inoculation for youngsters. Callum Semple, a professor of child health at Britain's University of Liverpool and British government advisor, told media he is not persuaded the evidence is strong enough to support vaccination of teenagers, as the risk to them from the virus was incredibly low, and because we don't have complete safety data for the vaccines. So that seems really sensible to me. But there's a maniacal push to get a vaccine in every single human being, whether the science supports it or not. And you're a bad person if you point this out. Well, I'm not a bad person. I'm like I always am. I'm debunking the bullshit narrative of the establishment and showing you where they're not being truthful, honest, logical, or consistent, and where they're being influenced by money. And if you're a lefty, you should be critiquing the COVID response from the fucking government and the establishment. You have no critique. You have no critical view of how they're handling this. Are you all Keith Olbermann morons? Are you all CNN employees? Really? And you think you're fucking anti-establishment lefties and you have no criticisms of the rollout of this? FDA officials have criticisms of it. The FDA person in charge of vaccine department at the FDA resigned over the Biden administration push for boosters, and that they weren't waiting for the science. The two expressed frustrations with the Biden administration handling of the COVID-19 vaccine booster shots, disagreeing with the push to offer them to the public prior to the FDA's approval. Business Insider reports how both Dr. Marion Gruber, director of the FDA's Office of Vaccine Research, the director of the Office Vaccine Research and Review, who's been with the agency for 32 frickin' years, and her deputy, Dr. Philip Krause, submitted their resignations. The two's departure was spurred by a disagreement with the White House premature pushing of the booster shots, as well differences with the FDA's head vaccine official. Members of the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention's Independent Vaccine Advisory Panel voiced frustration Monday with Biden administration's plan to begin doling out COVID-19 boosters next month, arguing the announcement got ahead of federal regulators and could exacerbate vaccine hesitancy. So that's what people claim I'm doing by giving people facts that you're not going to hear from the Pfizer-sponsored media. They say, I'm pushing vaccine hesitancy. I'm pushing vaccine knowledge. I want vaccine awareness. I want people to know how we're supposed to be doing this to get out of an outbreak in a pandemic like this with a super leaky vaccine. CDC committee members made clear they were irked that the announcement came before federal regulators and scientists formally endorsed the booster doses. The Biden administration's decision to announce it would offer boosters to all adults has created an awkward situation for federal regulators who are now left to chart a path forward despite limited and sometimes confusing data on vaccines' effectiveness over time. Yeah, so let's watch this. This is the CDC director.
I understand when the president stands up there and says we're probably going to open this up anyway, and you're saying wait and see, there's some confusion. Are you going to recommend boosters for the general population?
You know, I recognize that confusion. Right now, our recommendation is for these limited people in the population over 65, high-risk workers, high-risk community occupations, as well as high-risk by comorbidities. We are evaluating this science in real time.
So that is what Dr. Robert Malone recommended we do to begin with. Was what she's recommending now for the boosters, that you give it to people who are vulnerable and in very high risk occupations. That's what she's recommending. That's what Dr. Robert Malone, who invented the mRNA vaccine technology, that's what he said on this show. And now that's what she's saying. And then the head of the FDA resigned. The head of the vaccine department at the FDA resigned. So now the problems are gone. That's how I look at it. And here's Jen Psaki trying to clear up the confusion. Watch her try to clear this up.
A concern that after all the back and forth on the advice and guidance from the government, people are confused about the booster and maybe even more doubtful about it.
Well, I would say the reason we did this chart is because sometimes it's self-perpetuating. If everybody here is saying it's confusing, then people are going to think it's confusing. And so what I'm trying to do is alleviate the confusion, right? And explain these are exactly the categories. Anyone who's had a Pfizer shot 6 months ago, go get another shot. If you took Moderna
That's not what it says. That's not what they're saying. They're not saying anybody who got a Pfizer shot 6 months ago. That's not even what they're saying. They're saying, you just heard what the CDC director said, right? Vaccinate the vulnerable people in high-risk occupations. And Jen Psaki just said a totally different thing. She doesn't even know what she's saying. Hey, to make things less confusing, here's a Rubik's Cube that we put together for you that doesn't make any sense, and then I'm going to misquote it.
J&J, they're still considering that data. Don't get the shot yet, not approved yet. So we want to do everything we can to alleviate any confusion, answer questions people have. President went and got his shot, his booster shot on camera to make clear it's safe, it's effective, it's something you should do if you're in one of these categories.
There you go. There you go. She wasn't even correct about that. Because I want to go back. I want to show it. Oh, I can't. Anyway, who cares? Joe Biden, she's like, oh, if people say it's confusing, then they'll think it's confusing because they heard someone say it's confusing. No, that's not why people think it's confusing, Jen. It's confusing because you're giving misinformation left and right, and so does President Biden every time he talks about COVID. He gives misinformation about it, like saying things like, you can't catch COVID if you're vaccinated, like he said on a town hall. Like, that's why people are confused, because you guys don't know what the science is, and Fauci keeps lying left and right and changing the story to fit the narrative of the politics of the moment. Go ahead.
You know what's so pernicious, Jimmy? And you have this constant stream of confused messaging from the sources of authority, whether in the government or in the corporate world or wherever, where they're always contradicting themselves. They're always fuzzing up what they're recommending in a way that even if you're a diligent citizen, you're going to sometimes be befuddled as to what is even being recommended anymore.
Yeah.
And yet they could turn around and declare that somebody making what they regard to be a rational risk assessment as to whether they or their child should get the vaccine, they are now to be prohibited from engaging in just the basic activities of a normal life. I mean, they are to have their foundational liberties curtailed or drastically restricted. I mean, so they're not to travel. They might not even be able to board a plane at some point. They can't enter into an entertainment venue or a restaurant. I was just happened to be in Quebec, Canada, and it's this sort of absurdist situation where in order to enter a venue as kind of trivial as a food court in a mall, you have to kind of get approval from a security guard who's been deputized to check your vaccine status, and then kind of compare that to a government-issued ID, and then they'll let you in and go sit in the food court, and you can munch on your fries. I mean, this is the kind of system that they're setting up. So they kind of purport to be the paragons of all rationality, and they are communicating the most kind of pristine version of what the current science is and what people should do in their ordinary lives to follow along with that scientific consensus. And yet it's always constantly muddled. It's always contradictory, and they're always having to revise stuff and walk stuff back. And there are other countries around the world that we don't seem to be we don't generally regard as like zealous or right wing or something, like the UK or like Sweden or other places that take a substantially different approach, and that's to be disregarded. Somehow these American officials, and it even trickles down to like college administrators, somehow they're to just be mindlessly venerated as possessing the unalterable truth, yet somebody who in their own private lives, especially knowing that vaccination does not prevent transmission. I mean, that's a key finding that we've made. In their own private lives makes a rational risk assessment. No, somehow that warrants them being excluded from just the basic liberties that are afforded to them by virtue of being a U.S. citizen. So there's a major contradiction there and a tension there that nobody seems to bother wanting to explore, because if you do explore it, then, as we said from the outset of this conversation, you get slimed as being some kind of horrendous anti-vaxxer, even if you give your disclosure, as I've now done several times, that you got the vaccine, and you think if you make a rational risk assessment that says getting the vaccine is the correct thing for you or your family or whoever, then do it. But it doesn't mean that we have to have now this all-encompassing, one-size-fits-all prescription for everybody in a pluralistic society with different values and different beliefs as to what science compels them to do. Doesn't mean that we should now swipe the rug from under them and make it so that they can't even enter a restaurant anymore without being hassled or without causing a big fuss. I mean, it's so self-contradictory on so many levels, and you're not going to get any exploration of that from the mainstream.
It's just
sources that you and I both rightly disdain.
And it's ubiquitous, the crazy contradictory regulations. Like, for instance, I just flew. I went to Buffalo, and I had to get on an elevator at the airport, and they would only let 2 people in the elevator at a time at the airport. I'm getting on a fucking plane, and you're going to pack me in like a sardine. But I got to worry about being in this elevator? It's crazy. So that doesn't make any sense. And then
my favorite was I was driving to Canada, right? So I crossed over the land border, and when I was talking to the border agent, sitting in my car, she was in a booth. She said, "Oh, can you please put your mask on?" Now, she's like 6 feet away from me in a booth with her mask on. I'm sitting alone in my car with the window 80% rolled up. And in order to continue on with the interaction, I have to put my mask on. I don't care that much ultimately about putting the mask on, but sometimes you have to pause and just appreciate the absurdity. And then in order to get back in, and people don't know this because nobody in a position of power in the Biden administration has ever asked about it, bizarrely. But even to this day, right now, October, whatever it is, 27, a Canadian citizen cannot drive over the land border into the United States.
That's right.
They're barred. They're prohibited from doing so, but they can fly into the United States from like Montreal or Toronto or something, and that's perfectly fine. So, in other words, they can go to a crowded airport where they're mingling with God knows who, breathing in God knows what particles, and then they can get on the plane if they can produce their dopey little, rapid antigen test result. But they can't drive alone in their private vehicle over the land border into the U.S. So I don't know if you've been in Canada recently, but you cross over back into the U.S. and these border checkpoints are totally deserted. And it just doesn't make any sense at all. And these border communities, in like upstate Erie County, New York, or northern Vermont or wherever, or Washington or something, they've been economically devastated from this, because they rely on like Canadian commerce coming into them. So you have even a situation where there's a private helicopter service in Windsor, Ontario, that'll take you the 10 minutes to fly over the border into Detroit, but because you can't drive through the tunnel to get into Detroit. Even now, supposedly this is going to be lifted in November, but who knows? And so you have stuff like that piling up where it's just comically arbitrary. I mean, nobody is even asked to justify it. Everybody, when they're told about it, that I've talked to, just kind of shrugs in incredulity about how just stupid it is, and yet everybody's supposed to play along as if this is just totally sensible, and we're supposed to respect the decrees handed down by the people in charge of crafting such a nonsensical policy, as though they have the eternal right to punish you for making what you regard to be a rational risk assessment, as for example, as to whether your 2-year-old toddler should get a vaccine, or maybe because the risk is so astronomically low, as established by mountains of scientific evidence, maybe it's not like the most crucial thing in the world to rush them into the injection center. So I mean, it's upside down.
I was just in Buffalo last weekend, as I said, and I found out, I got a lot of emails from people saying, I normally would come see you. I saw you last time. I can't come. I'm in Canada. So there's a lot of people that come to Buffalo for my comedy show from Canada that weren't allowed to come. So that's like 30% of my audience when I go to Buffalo. And that was complete bullshit. Yes, I couldn't believe it when I found out about that. Again, we're all going to get the virus. You're not going to get out of this. Everyone is going to get the virus, just like you're going to get the flu, and this is going to be around for years and years. You cannot vaccinate your way out of the COVID-19 virus. If you are afraid of the virus, get the vaccine. It'll keep you from probably being hospitalized or getting sick. That's what the science says. But it's not going to keep you from getting it. You're going to get it. Okay.
And Our media is so pathetic in this country that we can't even get simple answers to questions about the irrational policy measures that the federal government is imposing, and don't even have to provide an explanation for. Like on top of the Canadian land border thing, and it's not an issue if you don't travel internationally or you don't have friends or family who want to travel into the United States. But for example, air travel from the European Union and the UK has been prohibited since March of 2020. Right, so you cannot fly directly from the France, the United Kingdom, Germany, wherever, into the U.S. if you are not a U.S. citizen. That's barred. That's against the law. You can't do it. Doesn't matter what test you get, what vaccine you get. Still not allowed. Supposedly we're lifting it next month, but who knows? And yet, at the same time, you can fly in from Turkey and Mexico, which have Mexico has way higher COVID rates and way lower vaccination rates than, for example, France or the UK. So, not to say it's the biggest crime against humanity that I've ever heard of, but at a certain point, this total nonsensicality of these measures add up and make you question the whole paradigm, right? Because I don't know about you, but I almost take visceral offense to this idea that I'm just supposed to accept stuff that makes no sense. And that the people who demand that I accept it won't even bother attempting to explain the rationale for? I mean, it's kind of an insult to your intelligence.
Yeah, well, it was just like when Dr. Sanjay Gupta did actual journalism for once and asked Dr. Fauci on camera, hey, if people have the antibodies because they already had COVID and that gives them a better immunity than the vaccine, or at least as good, why do they have to get vaccinated? And Dr. Fauci's response was, I don't have a really solid answer for you on that, Sanjay. That's what he said. And
that accent is deeply offensive to native Brooklynites, by the way.
Okay. All right. So there they are. They're rolling out the vax for your kids. And I would say educate yourself. We don't give any advice here. This is not a medical advice show. What we do is we criticize the establishment narrative when it deserves it. And that's what we're doing. And we're giving you more accurate information than obviously you're getting from the Pfizer-sponsored establishment media. Like, again, most of my friends who I consider super up on things and super lefties, even they don't know that they're going to get it. And then I show them the tweet by Andy Slavitt, the director of COVID response from Joe Biden's administration, and he says you're all going to get it. And they go, really? I never heard that. Well, the fucking guy tweeted it out. And what else can you want? Plus, you know why you never heard it? Because the people you're turning to information from don't want you to know that for some reason. Maybe it's because they're sponsored by Pfizer. And Pfizer doesn't want you to know that we cannot vaccinate our way out of this pandemic. Maybe that's why you're not getting seems like that's what Chomsky would say. I want to let you know, on November 6th, we're going to be in Baltimore. November 11th, we're in Tempe, Arizona. November 12th, we're doing Los Angeles and Studio City. November 19th, Los Angeles and Studio City. And then Thanksgiving weekend in Portland, Oregon. Go to jimmydorecomedy.com for a link for all those tickets.